So let's get started with this family unit webinar. Sometimes this is one of those topics that's a little bit challenging to talk about. So we're going to try to help us talk about it more. So we're bringing Taylor Berhow, who is from the University of Utah Health. She and myself and Cheryl Morazzo will be on talking through sometimes sensitive topics, sometimes hard to talk about topics. So excited to get started on that. We're going to just have a live discussion on the screen with the three of us, and you on the screen on the other side of this. Please hop in and join us in these discussions. Followed by that, we have a genetic carrier health presentation from Kimberly Nugent out of Children's Hospital of San Antonio. That is a recorded webinar or presentation, so it's on demand now. If you go to our website, you can find that now. Trying to reduce the virtual fatigue that we're all going through, we went ahead and recorded that in advance, so that way it's still part of this topic, still extremely important, and there's a lot of great information that Kimberly reviewed in her presentation, so do check that out when you can. And then we also will have NS Pharma and PTC on the line today live. They will be talking and answering any questions from their recorded presentations that we saw at our last webinar. Okay, so who is Taylor? Taylor is a social worker and behavioral health specialist out of the University of Utah. She's been working with individuals with neurological diseases for over 5 years and with children and families in mental health settings for nearly 10. She's enjoyed working for a variety of nonprofit and medical institutions and helping to address the integration of mental and physical health needs of individuals and their families from a variety of medical and family system perspectives. She has a bachelor's in political science and a master's in both social work and public administration. Currently, she works as a social worker and neurobehavioral health specialist for the University of Utah and the Behavioral Health Integration Outpatient Specialty Neurology Clinic. So I'd like to bring on with us today Taylor and Cheryl. Hey, Taylor.
Hi, everyone. Nice to be here. Thanks for your time.
Yeah, thank you so much for joining. So I went through kind of your bio. I was reading, wow, extensive. That's fantastic. But I'd love to take a moment right now just to let the audience know, like, who are we? Who are these three people on the screen that they're going to be talking today? So you've heard a little bit about me. I think that's, I'm good. So I shared a little bit about you, Taylor, but any personal pieces that you might want to share.
Yeah, I mean, so I started out doing something completely different than I'm doing now, and intended to kind of go into politics and law, and just found it just wasn't fulfilling the need that I had professionally, and ended up in social work. I find myself particularly passionate about just the intersection between healthcare and health policy, and especially kind of coincidentally, but now have felt really passionate towards families and individuals and patients who don't get to access the healthcare system in the way that lots of people without those types of diagnoses do. And so that intersection between some of those more rare diseases, neuromuscular diseases, neurological conditions, and just providing access and support is something that I feel really passionate about, and something I've been doing for the last several years. So
yeah, well, it seems like definitely a common thread, and I never thought I would be working for Cure Duchenne. I'm a speech pathologist by training, worked in the school setting for 25 years, but my son was diagnosed with Duchenne. And you change, you do whatever, and so, and here's my passion, it's my children and all the other children that I've been able to meet as a result of being part of this Duchenne family. So
yeah, I love
yeah. So there's a common thread already. Look at that. And then Cheryl, my friend Cheryl, please.
Hello, I am Cheryl. I live near Boston. I am a mother. I am a grandmother. I have 3 children. 2 have Duchenne. My son is manifesting, obviously has the Duchenne issues, and my daughter's a carrier. No family history, so we had no idea. I didn't know what Duchenne was until they told me that my son had it. So I was pretty shocked that apparently I've had that gene all along. And I didn't expect to be working for Cure Duchenne either. But as Tiffany said, my son was diagnosed, and I wanted to do whatever I could do to help save him and all the other boys with Duchenne.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and jump into some of these questions. We've got a few to get us started. So I'll post these, and then you guys, let's just hop in and chat about them. And please, you guys on the webinar, feel free to drop any of your questions or comments into the chat and Q&A boxes. But let's talk to how a family unit's dynamic changes when a child is diagnosed with Duchenne. I know, speaking from experience, it was total punch in the gut, right? And we all kind of were scrambling, right? Like I felt like I was just figuring out how to love him a lot more, and how I needed to savor every single second, where my husband was online, like searching up, what is this? What do we do? Where do we go? What, you know, so it's amazing how you just see, you know, instantly, you know, and then how do you not separate? How do you come back together? You know, it's very, you know, punch to the gut, I think would be my response. What about you, Cheryl?
Same. Like I said, I really had no idea what Duchenne was until they said your son has this, and you Google it. And again, a punch in the gut, slap in the face. It's just, you're like, wait a second, what? You know, what, this is going to happen to my child. But for me, it took me, you know, a little time before I was even able to explain to people what was happening with us. Because you really don't get the genetic aspect of it until later. You just hear muscular dystrophy. And Googling Duchenne 10 years ago, it was devastating. And one of the things that I would let family members know is, you know, they'd say, what can I do? And I'm like, I have no idea right now. I don't even know what I'm doing. But as soon as I know, I will let you know. But it's fine. It's funny how the dynamic changed. Like a lot of people that you thought would be right there next to you, fighting this with you, ran really far away. And one even said to me, I don't know what to say. I don't know what to do to help. So staying away was easier for them. But as time went on, I was able to pull more and more people in, but you also needed to accept that some people were not going to take this ride, this journey with you. And that's okay. You know,
Yeah.
eventually they'll get there. I don't know,
Yeah.
Taylor, if you have any sort of recommendations on the best way to sort of let people know what's going on and how they can help you, and then accept the help after that.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think the experiences that both of you shared are really common, and something that I see in my patients and their families every single day. I think a component or an approach that I often try to introduce with patients and families that I think is maybe a little bit revelatory in the moment is that receiving a diagnosis like this is not just a diagnosis for your child or for you, but your entire family and your entire community in a lot of ways. And also, there's a lot of grief and loss associated with that diagnosis. When we think of grief, we often think of, you know, someone passing away, or, you know, a really large, tangible, big thing that you know, everyone in the world just automatically associates with grief. And something like this is much more complicated, especially when you're kind of at a loss for words of how to explain it. If your child is diagnosed when they're very young, especially to the outside world, to your friends and family, at least initially, especially while your child is still ambulatory, there isn't that understanding, and there isn't really a lot of space held for the grief that you are experiencing as a parent and as a family. So reframing the emotions that you're experiencing, and reframing the approach in a grief and loss framework, I think can be really helpful. And that being said, everyone in the family, everyone in the community is going to be grieving in a different way. Grief is massively complex and looks different for everybody. unfortunately, that can be really frustrating. Your reaction might be very somber, isolating, you're turning inward. You have maybe a spouse or a child or a family member who is grieving in a completely different way, maybe exhibiting anger or detachment or frustration. And that can be really hard to understand. Like, do you even care? You haven't even cried one single time
Yeah.
since we found this out. And I've been crying every single night. Or like you mentioned, Cheryl, sometimes, especially when people don't know how to manage or to handle something like this, it's easier to just kind of turn away and to not dive in and be involved. And that can be both just literally and functionally damaging, expecting that support from somebody that you assumed would be there, but also just emotionally challenging to not have that type of support. And so I think those are some of the biggest dynamics that often, at least initially, play out when you receive a diagnosis like this, in addition to just all of the other logistical pieces that you have to kind of start to consider when you're a family that's affected by a diagnosis like this, be that increased medical responsibilities and appointments and health insurance and, all of those dynamics. And then of course, life doesn't stop just because you received a diagnosis like this. There's still just the regular difficulties and regular responsibilities of life of being a parent.
Yeah.
I think
I
sorry.
want to note, no, that's okay. I want to just note, Ashley shared a comment with us, and this is another great point. Her son was diagnosed at 4 months old. She had never heard of it before until then. She has 6 other children besides him. So she's got the older ones down to explain, and they're actually, they're very helpful, but we're learning together. So, we've got, it's interesting because you've got just your core family unit, the parent, the caretakers, the children, and then the extended. So it's like, if we could maybe, let's talk to like, how do we cope and deal within the internal? Like my son, I have my daughter is 3 years younger than my son. So when he was diagnosed, I couldn't clearly communicate to her at that age what was going on, nor could she see anything. I had some play therapy sessions that we scheduled for the 2 of them without any parent or guardian with them. But let's talk to like, let's like kind of focus in on the sibling component and then maybe expand out to grandparents and other family members.
I think to another slap in the face too was my daughter, because now I found out I was a carrier and there was a possibility that it was going to continue. And that was really challenging as well.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point that I was hoping we would touch on at some point today. Just that multi-generational impact of a disease like this. There's lots of different types of neurological conditions and neuromuscular conditions. Duchenne is particularly unique because of that really direct multi-generational component. And I think there's some space to talk about that a little bit later on as well. In terms of, looking at the family system from a micro system and then expanding outward. One of the big trends that I see and that I try and provide some coaching and counseling on with patients is something that I call like the well child versus the sick child syndrome. And those are obviously just very generalized terms. Not everybody fits into that category perfectly, but those are kind of the colloquial scientific terms that have been given for this type of psychological effect that a disease or diagnosis like this can have. Because obviously our focus and our attention is immediately on our child who is affected and who's diagnosed, as it should be. It makes sense that that's where we're directing our energy and that's where most of our time and attention is spent. Of course, when you have other children who aren't affected, especially children who are highly functional, very independent. You mentioned that individual who had, 6 other children who are all older and great helpers. And so it's really easy to just be grateful and assume that they can jump in and be helpful. And especially when you have so much going on, that type of resource is absolutely invaluable. What I do find frequently is children like that they're not without impact from the disease either, right? A well child syndrome, or the perfect child syndrome, as you will, is when a child, an unaffected child who is remarkably functional and independent and helpful, often finds themselves in a place where they feel like they have to be in order to receive love and support from their parent. They watch how stressful it is to raise a family and to navigate a family system when there's a diagnosis like this, and they can feel and experience that if they don't step up to the plate, if they don't step in and be helpful, things will fall apart, or they won't feel loved in the same way as if they weren't to step up to the plate and be helpful. And this plays out in a lot of different family dynamics, but it's something I see really commonly in our Duchenne affected families. How do you navigate that? How do you mitigate that? The first thing is just by calling it out and recognizing it. A big trend in the work that I do with families with neurological conditions is just practicing honest and open communication. Just recognizing and calling trends and patterns out like that is a huge step in navigating it, right? And so just acknowledging it to yourself, most of all, but also to your children is a big piece of it. And then giving those children, both your affected child and your unaffected children or child, space to process and space to talk about it. Those are really unfamiliar emotions. As children, we don't necessarily know what's going on. We're looking for two things, essentially: to feel love, to feel acceptance, and then to survive, right? And so if you feel as a child, an unaffected child, that the way to feel love and acceptance and then to survive in your family unit is to be supportive and independent and kind of take care of yourself, you don't know that that's what's going on. You just know that that's the way to do it. And so calling that out, giving that space for your unaffected child or children to discuss and to talk about it, I think is the first step. And actually, honestly, a huge barrier removed in kind of mitigating and navigating that. Of course, the affected child, there's complexity there, and I'm not sure if you want to dive into that right now or a little bit later, but certainly, obviously, the disease and the diagnosis will affect them completely differently.
Absolutely. Well, and I think, like you said, just recognizing it and acknowledging it and all of those, that's helping you move forward in the right direction. Just recognizing it's
Right.
it's how do we come to that point though, Taylor? And how do we cope with it? I mean, there was a time it bothered me. I wanted to make sure that my daughter had equal opportunity as my son, and I was on the road getting my son appointments constantly, and not so much for her. So it's how do you find that balance? I know it can be, but who do you lean on? Where, any particular resources or?
Yeah, I think one way to approach it is to kind of remove the word equal and replace it with the word equitable, right? So if you have this idea that you want your children to be treated fairly and equally, that's never going to happen in a situation like this because your children are so different and the needs that they have are so different. Equitable or equity implies that we just want them to have all of their needs met, even if their needs are different. And of course, that's easier said than done. And in terms of resources, it's difficult and challenging. I mean, I first of all always recommend that when a family is diagnosed, and I obviously intentionally use the word family diagnosis, that they start working with an outpatient licensed clinical social worker or a licensed marriage and family therapist. In an ideal world, somebody who has experience with chronic or progressive illness, but that's not always an option. At the very least, working with somebody who has a lot of experience in like family systems therapy, with child therapy, and just having an independent, unbiased third party to help you navigate that. How do I address all of these needs, even though they're so different? And I think that's the first big step. The other piece is, so much of your perception of your child's need comes from your own implicit bias and your own experience. And so you're doing your children a disservice by not addressing those within yourself, right? So also setting up space and time to do your own work related to, related to how you're approaching, how you're grieving, how you're managing it. It's really hard sometimes to be in a position where you can ask for help, or where you can navigate some of the emotions associated with a situation like this. And also, if you don't, you're doing your own family and your own children a disservice. And that's not meant to be shameful, or meant to, add shame to an already really difficult experience. But that tends to be something that motivates families that I work with, and parents that I work with, to take care of themselves, rather than, just putting, our natural inclination as parents anyway is to put ourselves last and our children first.
Oh, yeah.
And more than ever, more than any other parental situation, putting yourself first in some ways is incredibly invaluable in this situation.
We're gonna talk more on that a little bit later. This has been a great conversation so far. Yeah. So, but let's this next slide, I think, is going to talk to, beyond that immediate family. Setting boundaries, if you will, with our extended support systems. How can we manage these conversations, these relationships with family members who deny the diagnosis, or they don't understand, or they're not willing to understand from our perspective, right? Let's get into that conversation.
Yeah. That's unbelievably challenging and frustrating and just emotionally exhausting, right? I mean, anyone who has experienced any sort of deeply effective diagnosis knows this to be the case. And the reality is, anyone who has not experienced that can never fully understand. And that part of that is a component of the frustration and sometimes the miscommunication. Things that I found to be helpful for my families that I work with are recognizing that, first of all, back to that grief conversation, right? If you have a grandparent or a cousin or, an extended member of your support system, whatever that looks like for you, they also are grieving the loss of what was once normal to them. And especially for individuals who don't have a lot of awareness about what that grief looks like, which is most of us, because that's just not something that's really talked about, or education is not really provided on those types of topics. We don't go to emotion school. We don't go to therapy school, right? We don't know that it's grief, right? We just know that this is a crazy thing that you're talking about, and your son seems fine. He's walking. I don't know what you're talking about. Like, this is crazy. Like, right? There's so much misinformation, and you combine that with grief and fear and the unknown, and that can get really messy emotionally. And so just recognizing that as a parent is going to be your first step, that it's likely not personal, but it is that individual's personal issue or inability to really understand and process. Because if you take it personally, it becomes immediately a shame or guilt-based reaction, and that can be very heavy and very challenging to navigate.
And it's extremely hard not to take it personally, Taylor.
Absolutely.
I speak from experience. Like, it was rough, and for so long, why can't you look? Let me show you this, do this, let me show you, please look, please ask, please come, and then I finally now, I've been on the journey quite some time, so I'm finally now understanding, look, it's not me, it's them, like, and no fault, it's no love lost, it's nothing like that. It's just, I end up feeling sorry for them. Like, you've missed out, you have missed out on this child's life because you can't, whatever's the reasoning, I don't know, but I just kind of, I've reached a point, just let it go.
Yeah, and like you say, that's not a point that you can get to quickly or easily. There's no user manual or instruction manual on how to get there.
And there's the anger that you feel. And when you have full of anger, it's really hard to take care of yourself, right? When you're angry, you're expecting something from this person that maybe is not able to give it to you. A prime example was my mom. She's like, well, he's still walking. He looks a little funny, but he's still walking. So she never really understood. And she was a little older, so the internet's really not her best friend. And so it was hard to, and then then it finally clicked with her and the whole dynamic changed. But I needed her to come along. Like I was there right away, but that was not her path.
Right. Right. And you bring up a good point that it's not, it's complicated. Like those emotions are often conflicting with one another, love for somebody, anger towards that same person, all at the same time. And that's really messy. I think, using some really basic emotional awareness, kind of cognitive behavioral therapy techniques in this situation can be really helpful. And what I mean by that is recognizing that the emotions you're experiencing aren't bad or good, not associating any sort of value judgment towards the emotion, right? Like if you're feeling anger, then just feel anger. That anger isn't going to last forever, but it is a thing that you're experiencing now. And you need to not invalidate your own experience by, guilting or shaming yourself for feeling a certain emotion. Recognize that that looks differently for everybody, and you're going to experience a mixed bag of emotions, especially when it's connected to people who you expected or had expectations to love and support you. And so that's another reason, and another really important component of meeting with kind of an independent individual who's unbiased and who can provide like support and guidance in a therapeutically appropriate way. Beyond that, there's a couple things that I also recommend for families who are dealing with difficult kind of extended family support systems. The first thing is, because it's such an emotional experience and such an emotional issue, I always recommend that parents and moms and families kind of come up with some pretty clear communication strategies and talking points that are kind of previously decided upon and listed out before you have conversations like this, right? And so what that can look like is, you generally know the vibe, if you will, of your family, those conversations, being able to just draw from a list rather than just kind of, right, it's like any difficult conversation. In the moment, we have to get emotionally flooded or we feel overwhelmed. Being able to have like a really clear architectural layout for conversations sometimes, especially ones that you're probably having over and over and over again, can make that a little bit easier to navigate. It sounds sort of silly, but I encourage people to practice having those difficult conversations, either just with themselves or with like a friend or a family member. I can't tell you the number of times I've encouraged patients to just like talk aloud in your car to yourself and imagine that conversation happening, almost reciting it, memorizing it. And that way, when you find yourself in a situation where somebody isn't responding the way you expected or you hoped, you're able to navigate that conversation with clarity. You've practiced it. You kind of have expectations for how you can navigate it. So just kind of practicing it. And the other big piece is use professional resources, right? Like you shouldn't be expected to be your child's neuromuscular physician. Like you're not an expert in this yet. You probably will be at some point. You'll probably know a lot more than your provider at some point too. But right, like the expectation that you have to know everything and have an answer to every single question that family members throw at you is unrealistic and often painful and overwhelming. And so use those professional resources. If you don't have an answer to a question, it's okay if that's okay. And you can tell them that I don't know the answer to that question. Let me get back to you, or let me direct you to these places for you to like do a little bit of your own research. You're not emotionally responsible for their frustration or overwhelm. You're emotionally responsible for yourself and for your child.
Well, great point. Yeah.
I like too how you talk about having that conversation, because I found with some of my really close friends, I would tell them what Jake had and what it was, and they would immediately start sobbing. And I'm like, look, I'm barely able to hold myself up right now. So I think having like a sort of a public service announcement type of a way to talk about it is perfect. And journaling helped me a lot to sort of get everything down on paper. And every year I look over it and sort of remember what I went through and almost what I forgot at this point. But
yeah, I like that. I've also actually recommended especially if you find yourself having this conversation really regularly with people, designating like a spokesperson, a family spokesperson, be that like a close family member that's maybe a little bit removed, or a trusted friend or something like that, that people can direct their questions toward. Sometimes that helps because you can just remove yourself from the situation a little bit and let them kind of handle the emotional fallout from everyone else's emotional reactions. That's worked really, really well for a lot of families that I've worked with. Just kind of like, hey, I'm telling you this. I'm not really, and just being honest, right? Like, I'm not really in a place or position right now where I can kind of field or navigate all of your questions about this. If you have more, or if you like want to be helpful or supportive, contact my sister, contact my cousin, contact my friend. She knows everything. I know it's a little awkward, but she's been really helpful in helping me kind of navigate and fielding some of those questions. And just removing yourself one step from that, I think, can be really helpful for you, even though it seems a little quirky and awkward. I think actually diving into a solution like that can be remarkably helpful.
Yeah, for sure. We have another question still in the same kind of subtopic, if you will. But this is often a challenge, we're not, maybe, mom's in one house, dad's in another house. Mom's rules are this way, dad's rules are this way. Mom's not happy with what's happening at dad's, or vice versa. Like, how do we, that's a tough.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That can be really tricky, and that can present in like mixed family situations and separate, I mean, in all types of family dynamics, like
and even just going to grandma's house, or anything, just being out of the norm, or the main household, however we want to call it. But,
definitely. You'll notice a theme in a lot of my intervention suggestions, and the big theme is you need to have a really clear understanding of what your expectations are for people. When you are stressed and overwhelmed and tired and not sleeping and fearful, it is really, really challenging to know clearly what it is that you expect of people, from be it just from a supports perspective, or be it from like co-caregiving perspective, something like that. And so it's really, really important that you take the time to sit down with yourself or a family member or a therapist and make a list. I always recommend physical lists, physically writing it down or typing it out or putting it in your phone or recording it, for the same reason that, often, if you're in a lecture of some kind, taking notes and listening at the same time kind of drives the ideas home. It's really important that you're able to take some time and sit down and really make it clear to yourself, most of all, like what your expectations are for your child, and for how people interact and support and care for your child and your family. It's impossible, if nearly impossible, to be able to have, right, to make sure you're on the same page with people if you don't know what that page is for yourself. So that's kind of the first thing, and that takes some time and some energy, and it's really, really important. Like I mentioned in that little bullet point, that it's helpful to use pre-written lists and kind of pre-written talking points. That way you get into a conversation, especially one that might be a little tricky, especially if it's like an ex-spouse or an ex-partner, and there's already emotions kind of high, and you already have the same difficulties maybe that you already had for the same reasons that you're no longer together. It's helpful to just have a list that you can draw from, and specific talking points, so you don't find yourself in an emotionally flooded place. And I would say just be setting aside frequent and regular designated time for conversation, to be touching base. Ask that individual also to prepare in the same way, right? To ask them to do the work about their expectations, so you guys can be on the same page and know what that looks like.
Right. I mean, communication is so important. I mean, that's, common thread, and as a speech pathologist, I could say that ever so much, but it is, but it's so hard, because again, it's so hard to talk about your emotions. It's hard to label your emotions. It's hard to understand. We all come from different experiences and backgrounds. And so what we've witnessed as a child is still part of who we are. And
totally.
I have a question from a mom. You know, how do you encourage a loved one to talk to a therapist about coping with the diagnosis when they are resistant to that?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. There's still, unfortunately, a lot of stigma around accessing mental health resources. I think that one approach is just bringing it back to the welfare of the child, recognizing just for yourself and for anyone else involved, and stating this openly that you not doing the work or they not doing the work around the difficulties that come with this diagnosis. Is affecting the welfare of your child and your family. And you don't need to
Yeah,
say it in like a shaming or manipulative way, but just kind of speaking, using I language and speaking from your personal experience can be helpful too. Like, I was also resistant to this. I decided to try it, and I've found from my experience that this has been really beneficial in my interactions and with with this child, and my understanding with this, how to approach a caregiving situation with this child. So, and then of course, relinquishing expectations or any sort of idea that they're going to do it just because you
yeah,
asked, right? That's another
yeah.
piece too. It's like, and
Hard.
this is an age old adage in therapy that we can't take it personally when someone else doesn't want to get the help that they need. All you can do is take care of yourself and do your own work, and recognize that they will or they will not, and that could be something that you are working on in your own therapeutic process. But
And it could
making it
also
about
be
the
short
child, I think,
term,
can be helpful.
Yeah, yeah,
like a short term, like my husband and I, life is hard already, right? You add this to it, it's hard for a marriage. So we have a counselor. We'd go talk for a couple of hours, once a month or whatever it is. So it doesn't have to be like you need to go every day and
Right, right,
right, right,
you just go when you need to. And I
right,
mean, it's helped me in many different areas of my life, not just Duchenne.
right.
right. Yeah, normalizing it in a way that's just like, look, this isn't a permanent thing. It doesn't mean something's wrong. It just means that for our family and for this child, I think it makes sense to access a professional support system that has kind of an unbiased approach.
Yeah, yeah.
I think it's also important to set up the expectation that maybe the first therapist or social worker that you meet with isn't going to be a good fit. Sometimes that can be a huge turn
Sure.
off to people and really turn them off to the process. I always tell patients it's like dating. Sometimes you have to go on a few first dates before you find
Yeah,
somebody who's a good fit.
So true.
And so just setting up that expectation too, if you sense there, is an openness or an opening towards the idea.
absolutely. Um, we brought up talking about, talking with the child. So our next kind of topic is how do we empower him or her? How do we get them involved in these important conversations without making them feel like they are a burden or they're an issue within the family unit?
Oh yeah, that's so hard, and something that just like as a parent you just have so much empathy and emotion around. You're so protective over your child, and you're so, um, I mean, there's just not words. There's not words in the English language or
Yeah.
any language probably to explain those feelings. I would say one of the best ways that you can involve your child in important conversations, um, is involving them in important conversations, right? And I know that sounds so simple and so silly, but the reality is we as parents have a strong innate biological desire to protect our children, and for us that is often initially just wanting to shelter them and remove them
Right.
from the hard realities of this disease. And that is not the way to do it, right? Unfortunately, that's our natural inclination. That's what we want to do, and that's not the answer. Of course, there's like age specific language,
Sure.
and that's obviously very that's very tailored to the individual and the family. But making a habit and really starting from a young age to address, and involve and not shy away from the reality that your child has a disease that's going to impact their life. This is the same with your other children, or a child who are unaffected, right? Not involving them in the conversations. Children are very intuitive. They're very smart, especially our cute Duchenne kids. They're so smart, and they know that something isn't quote unquote normal without you even saying anything. And so what happens when you choose to not involve them in those conversations is they know something's wrong, and they think it's their fault. And they think it's something that they have done, or that's something that's upsetting to you that they've caused. And that is a whole can of worms, obviously, that you could spend hours talking about. But the biggest way to involve them is by involving them and bringing them into the conversation and not shying away. It's not something to be ashamed of. It's not something that they should have shame around. It is something they will naturally garner shame around unless you very actively and proactively address it. So that's kind of the first thing. I would say, you know, the other big things are, again, modeling, right? Like modeling that type of behavior and that open communication. When you're not open to talking about it, or when you're avoidant of it, or when you're not doing your own work, your kids are picking up on that. It's just like any other parenting situation in that way. If you want your children to, for example, like broccoli, the best way to show your children to like broccoli is by eating broccoli. That's as simple as that sounds. So if you want your children to have good emotional insight and awareness and be open and honest about the difficulties of this disease, then you have to be that way, and you have to open up that way. And the biggest and best thing is that emotions aren't bad. They're not bad. They're not good. They're just emotions. We are people with a biological need to experience emotions. And children should learn from a young age that it's okay that they're experiencing all different types of emotions, which means that you also have to model that it's okay to experience emotions. It's okay to cry in front of your kids if you're having a dialogue and conversation about why you're crying. It's okay to be angry or frustrated if you're communicating about why that is.
Exactly. And they actually are quite resilient. I remember Jake was slower, right? He knew something, exactly what you said. And once we said, you have this, he's like, oh,
I have
that explains it. What do we do now? And I think that, and also they have a gift they can give to the world, right? To teach empathy, but you have to be vulnerable for that, right? And sometimes Jake's 18, I can hear him talking about Duchenne, and it's like my words, right? So they do listen. When I hear him, I'm like, oh my God, we say that all the time. So, and I think it's important for them to feel empowered, so that they're more independent, so they can advocate for what they need from other people. And Google is a horrible thing, because my son Googled Duchenne before we had the tough conversation. So you don't really know the right time, and you hope that you do. But I think our kids are a lot more resilient than we are, you know?
Absolutely. Kids are so resilient. I love that point. I think that's beautiful. One of the ways we have fear around hurting them, or them being hurt or bullied, or like having to deal with difficult things, especially because of this multi-generational component of Duchenne. We want to save our kids and shelter them. And the truth is, like, kids can figure it out. Like, if we give them the tools and set them up for success, it's empowering to them, and empowering to our families to use honest and open communication and be honest and open about emotions.
I'll never forget our scientific officer, Michael Kelly, when I met him many years ago, and he's like, look, Will was equipped for this. Let him teach you. And he's right, I mean, and that's really how we've lived our life through this journey. So, and that kind of brings us to our next question. How do we empower our kids to set those boundaries and those expectations with their family member? Instead of me setting it up all the time, why not for him? So when he's going to his friend's house, how does he say, hey, I can't get up those stairs. We need a ramp here, so that he can be independent. We really want to foster independence, and they don't need us, as much as we want to think they do. They don't always need us, so.
Well, education and honest communication is empowering, like the slide says. And so, the first piece of it is, if you're addressing this and being open about this at an early age, the chances that your child's going to feel and experience shame around advocating for themselves decreases significantly. The whole goal here is for your child to be able to advocate and to be able to share those types of needs with other individuals without feeling fear or guilt or shame. And that, I think, looks like, beyond just having the conversation with your child, that also looks like when there are opportunities for your child to advocate, letting them advocate and not advocating for them, especially as they start to get older. And then also setting up space and time for you to process how that went for them and to answer their questions and to dialogue about it, right? That is one of the extra things that we have to do as Duchenne affected parents and families, is making sure that we're addressing some of that stuff regularly, right? If your child has a difficult experience at school, or classmate or a teacher who doesn't understand, or you're trying to advocate with an IEP, at school, and just having conversations about why that's hard, with your child. Like, you know what? Not everyone understands what this looks like. Not everyone's going to be open and supportive of this type of situation, and being honest and open about it, and not being not sheltering them away from that, and not pretending that that's not a reality of your life and their situation. It is a reality, and pretending that it's not, I think, again, kind of, they don't know what's wrong, but they know something's wrong with them if we're not addressing what's going on. And then using consent language. Consent is usually talked about in a completely different context, but I think that it's valuable for all children to learn, and especially children with a really affected integrated disease like Duchenne. It's okay to say yes and to say no, and really teaching what that language looks like, and then modeling it for yourself. And parents and moms, that looks like accepting help when people offer it to you. That's really hard. That's something that we all, that's the number one thing I feel like our Duchenne moms and caregivers struggle with, is actually accepting help. And you can't do it all on your own. Having your child watch other people support you is so invaluable too, knowing that they have a whole village behind them. Yeah.
We're going to move into supporting the caregivers in a second. I have another question that kind of ties in with this component here, is encouraging our sons with Duchenne to have those friendships. It's building relationships with their peers without causing fear. And I know it's hard, and where if the friend has Googled it, and knows more than he needs to know, or, thinks he knows more than he needs to know, and then he's a friend with our son with Duchenne, like, any suggestions on maybe some language that the child with Duchenne can communicate to the peers, or
well, I think the first thing is also recognizing in yourself, like, what are you fearful of, right? Like, if you're fearful of your child learning too much, or not having control over what your child learns information wise, just pausing for a moment and asking yourself, like, why am I fearful of that? Am I fearful of that because I feel like it's too much for my child? If so, why do I feel like it's too much? Just dialoguing and doing some fear clearing with yourself, because once again, most of the time our fear is based in our own experience and not necessarily our child's, and just making sure you're not projecting that fear onto your child is a big piece of that. Beyond that, I think that as your child gets older and you're having those types of conversations, you don't need to be a helicopter parent, but just listening in on conversations and checking in with your child, maybe after they're spending time with other kids who have Duchenne, asking questions about their family, forming relationships with their parents to kind of better understand what their approach to the disease is and what their approach to open and honest communication has been. And then, once again, modeling that by example, just being a parent that can dialogue with and really understand, like, is this scaring my child? Is my child fearful of this? And sometimes the answer will be yes. And then, doing some fear clearing with them and trying to understand what about that thing is fearful? Is it just the unknown? Is it, maybe the loss of ambulation? Like, fear is such a big kind of scary blanket term, really diving in and wanting to kind of get down to the
Well,
more
and I think it's, those kids out there that are coming up and saying, hey, did you know life expectancy is XYZ and you're not going to be here that, like kids, again, speak out of ignorance and lack
yes.
of, not ignorance, but, a lack of understanding
Mhm.
and, don't realize the weight of their words
Right.
sometimes. So,
And that's
yeah,
another reason why it's so important to be having those open and honest conversations
yeah,
with your children, because you know if you have an experience where a child is speaking out of turn like that, or
yeah,
not drawing information from like database sources, and you've already had a conversation with your child about what that actually looks like, that's less likely to be as impactful as you maybe fear it will be, because you're already having dialogue around that.
yeah.
And the other thing too is don't be afraid of what you see online, because I mean, I know a Duchenne gentleman who had a grandchild. So what is online is not necessarily what the truth is. And
Right.
in our home, you are born and then you leave this world, right? So that's a given. That's what happens. No, I feel that I don't know, when that will be. But we're going to make that dash in between as amazing as possible. And to have the child not be afraid, I think is a good thing. And try not to make the big milestones a bad thing to the children.
Mm,
Like with Jake, we never said when you stop walking, it's the worst thing in the world, right? Because
Yeah.
when it happens, you don't want them to feel that way, which sounds really easy to say.
Yeah.
yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
what we tried to do here.
The loss of ambulation is such a good example of kind of what we're talking about this in a more focused way. As a parent, you are so worried about, wanting to tell your kid that one day he will likely not be able to walk anymore. And so the easiest, or at least the initially easiest thing to do is to avoid talking about that and to not want to talk about it, right? Then you get into a situation where maybe your child makes friends with somebody who has done their own research, or their parent has, or whatever that looks like, or maybe they're older and they're already starting to lose ambulation, and now all of a sudden that is a much bigger deal than if you're having those conversations, hard as they may be beforehand. And I think that's a really good example.
Absolutely. Okay, let's go to our next topic. So supporting caregivers. I laugh because this is me. What kind of unique challenges are presented when a family member is a caregiver? Yeah, the balancing act. I will just answer with that, balancing it all. And we will get to that in the next slide, taking care of you first, which is extreme. It's harder than taking care of my son.
Absolutely. No question about that. Well, the first thing is the same approach that we want to take with our kids, creating space for your own feelings and emotions. Emotions aren't bad. They are not the enemy, though we have been raised in our culture and our society supports the idea that they are. We have been told like anger is bad, sadness is bad, happiness is good, joy is good. And so we do everything we can to seek out the good emotions and to avoid the bad ones.
Yeah.
So that's the first thing, is having implementing a practice, in whatever way is best for you, and getting some direction in whatever way is best for you, to start really practicing accepting the fact that emotions aren't bad, they just are. And this isn't anything new or anything different than we've already talked about, but
Right.
doing your own work, and having, again, lists. I always encourage, especially Duchenne moms, to make a list of things that have been helpful coping skills, right, at any
Yeah.
point in their life, or a list of things that make it better, that make things feel better. Because in the moment when you are overwhelmed and when you are stressed and when you have so much going on, you do not have the time or the patience to think of something to do for yourself, right? So having accessing a handy list where it's like, oh yeah, Taking a 5-minute walk has been really helpful for me before, or doing a quick meditation, or doing some coloring, or, going into the bathroom and turning the fan on and screaming, right? Like whatever it looks like, drawing from that list and being able to pull from those things in a pinch. I encourage patients to have a go-to 5-minute, 1 hour, and 1 day self-care practice. So the 5-minute one is just like whatever that looks like, right? Doing some deep diaphragmatic breathing, going for a walk, watching a YouTube video, whatever it looks like, right? A quick one that you can do in a pinch several times a day. A 1 hour one, a little bit longer, moving your body, doing some coloring, reading a book, watching a show, whatever that looks like. And then of course, like a day long or multi-day long, right? Going on vacation if you can, going out to eat with some friends, or doing, whatever that looks like, right? Like having kind of a go-to 5-minute, 1 hour, and 1 day or multi-hour practice that you can turn to in a pinch when you're feeling overwhelmed. So you don't have to think that through, right? It's almost just innate, and kind of a quick way to access
Automatic.
it. Yeah, exactly. The thing, one of the phrases that I really love and that I use with patients and families a lot is, unless it's the actual end of the world, it is not the end of the world. So, right, like unless the world is literally ending, the world isn't ending, and you can take 30 seconds, you can take 10 minutes to yourself to just breathe and to take care of yourself and to kind of reconnect and to be mindful about the situation, right? It may feel like the house is burning down, and the house isn't burning down. There's nothing so urgent in 99% of situations that you can't take 5 minutes to yourself or 30 seconds to yourself. There's nothing, right? And even just giving yourself that time and setting yourself that time for yourself is so valuable. I also like the phrase, stop the glorification of busy, right? Like we live in a world that, like, if the busy you are, the more you have going on, the more you take on, the more martyrdom that's happening, the more impressive, the more strong you are, the more, powerful you are. And that just isn't true, right? Sometimes the hardest thing, the thing that takes the most strength, is actually like eliminating things and taking care of yourself and doing
Saying
things.
no.
Yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, absolutely. And if you want your child to set good boundaries and have good consent and to be able to advocate for themselves, that's even more important, that you're modeling that ability to say no, and modeling that like activity pacing type behavior, I guess.
And what do they say when you get on a plane? Put your mask on first, right?
First,
And take
exactly.
care of that other person. And I know that it's hard, and some days it just doesn't happen, and you have to be okay with it.
Mhm.
But I think it's really important to take care of yourself. And as my son always says, when he gets all freaked out from his anxiety and I don't know how to deal with it, he says, Mom, breathe.
Yeah.
We will
Yeah.
figure it out, but just breathe. And sometimes that's all you need to do.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And starting somewhere, I mean, you might not have 5 minutes, right? There's right, you don't have it.
Right.
Start with 30 seconds. I mean,
Right.
just acknowledge that you matter, and you're not going to be worth anything to everyone else, and if you don't take care of you first.
Exactly.
So,
It's also muscle that you have to learn to exercise, right? I mean, if you've gone for years and years as an individual and as a woman and as a caregiver and as a mother and whoever, as anyone, we don't, like, our world, our culture, our society doesn't set us up for success for taking care of ourselves. And so I like that, starting small. It's like, even if it's just 10 seconds, like starting to practice and exercise that muscle of self-care. That's so important, right? Like that's where we start. And then we add more movement, more weight to the situation. And eventually you're like, okay, I can do it. I can take 10 minutes to myself, right? Whatever that looks like.
We kind of touched on many of the points that we were just talking about with this next slide. I think we covered the first one, and how to take care of ourselves, and like you said, stop the glorification of busy and saying no. And the other component to this, though, is then how can we ask for help and then accept that help? I mean, there's two arms to that help component too.
Yes. Yeah. Have you guys found something that's been helpful for you in accepting help? Because I know that is, oh my gosh, one of the hardest things.
Yeah, well, I did. It took me a long time, but Will needs assistance for showering, and um, I had some cardiomyopathy issues going on as a result of being a carrier, and a couple of years back, and I went to my husband and said, I can't do it. Like I physically cannot, and I need your help, and I need you to do X, Y. This is what I do. This blah, blah, blah. And I just need you to step in. And he did. And he's been doing it ever since. And so what a lift, right? Like for me to be able to ask it, to accept it, and what it has turned into, that's their special time together. So yeah, but it took a long time to get there, but it is invigorating when you can do it and let it go.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that asking for help as a mom, as a parent, is already hard enough. One of the things that another way to set yourself up for success is people, especially initially, when you are telling about the diagnosis. And that's the other thing too, right? We didn't even talk about that, but sometimes when your family's initially diagnosed with this, when your child is, there's a huge outpouring of support initially, and then it kind of like tapers off, right? I think that being able to make a list of things that are actually helpful, right? People are often so willing to help and so open to helping, but they don't know how, they don't know what to do. And it's okay that they don't, right? Like this is a really unique situation, and they're certainly not going to be experts at it either. I live in Utah. There's a really robust kind of religious community here. And one of the ways that that community tends to support is by offering to bring like dinner all the time, right? So I talk with my patients all the time about how many people in your neighborhood have offered to bring you dinner, and they're always like, oh, so many. I'm so sick of casseroles. And I'm like, right, yeah. So it's like, oh my gosh, please no more. And we joke about it and we laugh about it, and then I tell them, you know what? All of those people are probably willing to do whatever it is that you need help with, but because there isn't clarity or there isn't clear communication about what that is, their go-to is just to bring over dinner. It's like, my freezer only fits so many of your homemade casseroles. And so, right, like having even just a conversation with your family, your husband, your spouse, your partner, your co-caregiver, whatever that looks like, about like, well, what actually would be helpful? Would it be helpful for somebody to like go grocery shopping for my family like once a week, or to pick up my other child from school, or my children from school? Would it be helpful for someone to come over and just like clean my kitchen once a week? Would it be helpful for somebody to just like go out to lunch with me? Kind of get creative, think outside the box about what actually could be useful. And then when people ask, how can I help? You can draw from that list and actually provide them with a thing that's actually useful, not just like some frozen lasagna, right? I actually, that is one of the number one suggestions I feel like families will grasp onto when I make it in clinic rooms or in sessions, because it's like, oh yeah, like actually here's a list of things that I've already pre-compiled with my family and my support system. Any of these would be helpful. Like, could you help with any of these things? And if people are offering to help, they're usually very willing to do so. It's just they don't know how, or they don't know how to do it in an effective way.
Right. It's back to those expectations too,
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
Like what are we expecting? So.
And then just a soft and gentle reminder to yourself every time you feel resistance, or you feel yourself catching, or like to accepting help, just a gentle reminder, like, this isn't necessarily for me, like this is for my child. This is for
if you always bring it back to the child.
Yeah, exactly. Because that's usually the reason why we don't want to take care of ourselves or accept help, because we're like, I have to do this for my child. Right. So just a gentle reminder, like, this is for my child, this is for my family.
Yeah.
Somebody else can do it as good as you. Maybe not exactly as good as you, but me, I was like, nobody can take care of him like I do.
Right.
But then come to find out, maybe he doesn't want to be with you all the time, like,
right.
Yeah. It's all good. But someone can probably grocery shop for your family in the same, like, just as well as you can, unless you're like a super grocery shopper, which you might be, then pick something else,
Right. And then our next topic, which is the last one for our conversation today, is codependency, you know, and obviously we're a little biased today because there's 3 moms on the line. So, you know, but this can happen with dads too, and as well. But, you know, can you talk a little like why does this happen? I think it goes back to some of our innate human traits like you were referring to earlier. But, you know, why does it happen? How does it affect the family? And then how can we mitigate some of these issues?
Yeah. Well, providing just a little bit of clinical historical context, the term codependency, or often used, although not exactly the same, interchangeably with the term enmeshment, actually came from a study, kind of a qualitative sort of anecdotal study of individuals who were supporting alcoholics. And the idea was, right, like there's a support group for alcoholics. It was AA. And a woman who was married to an alcoholic recognized there's actually no support for people like partners or people who are you know, supporting somebody who's an alcoholic. And so she started one called Al-Anon. The concept, the idea is where it's a type of relationship where personal boundaries are kind of permeable and unclear. I like to describe it to people as you are feeling like you are taking on and feeling another person's emotions to the point where it is to your detriment, to where it is affecting you, right? And that's complicated because as a parent, that's naturally going to happen with your children. That's probably naturally going to happen to your spouse. And so to be clear, we're not trying to avoid that entirely, but any sort of when there's any sort of diagnosis made in a emotional or mental health setting, it's always, is the diagnosis, are the symptoms clinically distressing or significant? And so it is natural and normal to have a little bit of codependency in a family unit, a little bit of enmeshment. And also we want to observe like to what level is this happening, and is it clinically distressing or significant to one or both of the individuals? I think a relatable way to describe this is just kind of a desire to save, quote unquote, your child or someone from difficult situations, save them from their feelings, to save them from the harsh, dark, cold world, right? And if you can't save them, like there's so much guilt and shame and a lot of that placed onto your own burden, your own shoulders. The reason why this is so particularly relevant, I think, to this population and this group on here today is because lots of our moms are carriers, like you mentioned, for this disease. And so there's an additional level of guilt and shame associated, right? You feel like this is your fault. You feel like, especially when it's not really clearly explained or when there's not clear support, that like your children are going through this really difficult thing because of you. And so I think that the propensity to experience codependency and enmeshment is even more severe and even more present. And so how does that kind of play out? I think from a clinical perspective, from what I've observed, and again, I actually don't know of any studies on this, and this is something I think would be fascinating for someone to take on, but purely anecdotally, this I think looks like treating, right, like going back to that equity versus equality thing, you know, not holding your children to certain standards or not having boundaries with your kids, wanting to save your child from difficult situations, not having consequences for poor behavior. It's just more prevalent. There's just that intergenerational component of codependency there. And I think that that's a big component, is because of that genetic piece. And again, like there's not a lot of studies on this, or any that I'm aware of. And so my biggest piece in treating it is just to identify and to point out and to educate. And so just recognizing that in your own self. If you want to learn more about enmeshment and codependency, there's a really great book called Codependent No More by Melody Beatty. And I imagine
we can share that. Yeah, we'll share that information. Yeah.
Right. The context is obviously completely different because, again, it is more in the historical context that I provided earlier, but it can give you some really basic education about how you can kind of recognize codependency in yourself. And the truth is, if there's codependency with your child, there's a greater likelihood that you're also experiencing codependency enmeshment in other relationships too. And so addressing it from all kind of facets, I think, can be important.
Yeah, definitely.
Absolutely. It's a great book, by the way, too.
Love them.
My middle son is a heroin addict. So I was addicted to saving him. It's the same with Duchenne. And
Yes, I
thankfully I
love that phrase.
realized, because being independent is only better for my son.
Yes.
It's hard. It's really hard,
Yeah.
but
Yeah, I love
What's-
that. Addicted to saving them. I think
Yeah.
that's a really, really just articulate visual way of describing what that looks like when it is clinically
Absolutely.
depressing or significant. Yeah.
Absolutely. And I know we're on time, but there was one comment in the chat that I really just want to make sure that we'll end with this, because I think this is, I feel for this mom that posted this, but she has two sons, 8 and 6, and the older one blames her for the disease. Even she is a carrier, he doesn't know she's a carrier, but says this disease is all your fault. I'd love to be able to provide her with some insight on, how to manage that and navigate that and deflect that and not take it to, oh, it just pains me to read it out loud. So,
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that first of all, the little detail that he doesn't even know she's a carrier is really indicative in terms of treating the situation. Right? Like children often don't, right? Like they don't understand the full picture.
Yeah.
And so even, right, like they're looking for any sort of explanation or understanding
absolutely.
to kind of describe the circumstances that they find themselves in. It's going to be impossible to not take that personally as a mother. And also, it is your child's way of explaining something that is unexplainable to them, right? They don't know how to they don't really know how to process what's happening to them because they're an 8-year-old kid. And so you are the easiest person to place that onto, right? To parasite that onto. In terms of how you deal with it, there's like, right, like there is no good way to not take that burden on. But I do think that is potentially indicative of the need for some family conversation, some guided family conversation, whether, with a therapist, or, with anyone, a provider or a doctor, something like that. And then of course, making sure you're getting the support and guidance from a similar type of professional support. Working through that yourself, recognizing like there is additional guilt and shame here because in my mind, it is my fault, right? That's why that really hits home, is because it feels true. It feels like that statement is true. And while logistically speaking, practically speaking, it might be, we know logically that that's not yeah. I mean, that's not the case in reality. And so recognizing that the reason why that's sensitive, the reason why that really digs is because it feels true. Yeah.
Well, thank you for that. And Cure Duchenne is here. Our CARES program, is here to help families and put you together with people like Taylor to help. So, reach out to us too. So thank you, Taylor.
Yeah.
We had so much chatting going on. I was able to work through our chat box as we went through our conversation. So we're going to go ahead and move on to our next slides here, but really I appreciate your insights, Taylor. It was absolutely fantastic to chat with you today. And I'm speaking for Cheryl too. This is great. But yeah, we are definitely addicted to saving our sons. That's what we're doing. So
I think
we
that
just
was
have to
the
do it
line of
healthily.
the day. Yeah.
Yeah.
That really summed up everything, I think, really well.
For sure. Well, thank you so much for joining us. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone.
Great. All right, take care. Bye, Cheryl. Thank you.
thanks.
Okay, so Kimberly Nugent is a certified genetic counselor at Children's Hospital of San Antonio, as noted earlier and in your emails as well. Her presentation has been recorded already, so to save us some time and some virtual fatigue, you can go ahead and check that out at your leisure on our website. So find it. It's great information on genetic information.